You might have been wondering, why is my lower back so stiff? Why are my hips so stiff? Why have I got reduced range of motion? How can this all be helped, especially if we've got a lower back injury? Well, in this video, we're going to talk about that and much more. Go through 2 considerations that you need to think about in the context of this problem and solving it, and then 5 step-by-step in order instructions that you can do to really help improve the stiffness that you're getting, whether it's in the buttocks, whether it's in the legs, the hips, or whether it's in that lower back. Let's get into it. What would be helpful before we get into those first 2 things is discovering what we mean by ROM, range of motion. What is this? Well, all joints have a predefined range of motion, and a quick Google search you can find out what the range of motion, for example, in flexion, bring your knee towards your chest. What is the normal range of motion there? What is the normal range of motion for extension in the hips? And lots of others besides that. And knowing that any particular movement, whether it's maybe a squat, will require normal range of motion in a number of different areas to fulfill a normal movement. Now, we'll come back to this concept of ROM or range of motion as we go through this video, but just have that in mind because it really plays an important part in consideration number 1. The first consideration is stiff muscles. We could have stiff muscles that actually need stretching. The muscles in the hips, the muscles in the back are actually stiff and short and tight, and they need to be stretched out. And that's the first consideration. Number 2 is that those muscles are actually really weak, and they're holding on for dear life. They're really not working very well. They don't have the capacity required to function in normal day-to-day living, and therefore they become tight and stiff. And this is the second option. Now, the big problem with both of these is that quite often there's a failure to really verbalize why they're stiff or what that sensation of stiff even means or tight even means. People will often use that word, and therefore if something's stiff and tight, one would assume that we want to make it not stiff and tight, and if it's stiff and tight, we want to stretch it out to make it longer and less stiff and less tight, more elongated. And the problem with that is that it's just failing to fully understand the real problem that's causing those muscles to become stiff or tight. When it comes to lower back injuries, which lead to the stiffness that we're talking about in this video, it's quite often that the stiffness and tightness is caused by something a little bit deeper. It's caused by an injury in that lower back, and that is the real problem that we want to get to grips with. And in most cases, for example, bringing the knee into flexion, people have more than enough flexion in that hip. The hip is actually not that tight when we think about it. For a lot of people, not everybody, but a lot of people. But they will still persist in doing knee hug exercises, pulling that knee towards the chest. Now, the hip will generally, there are some variations, have around about 130 degrees of flexion. That means coming up this way. Most people have a good degree of flexion. Maybe the hamstrings are a little bit shortened and less mobile, but most of that in the early days, especially if we've got a more short-term back problem, comes from inhibition, coming from the injured structure in the lower back. So you can see it gets a little bit more complicated than just having a stiff hip and a stiff lower back. Now, just before we get into those 5 step-by-step action points to actually deal with this, just think about it. If you can get your knee right up to here, in that position there, they're not stiff. They might feel stiff, but objectively, they're not shortened. You have a normal range of motion through that hip. And quite often it's just the focus of endless knee hugs, endless child's pose, putting more and more flexion through there. And this goes back to those 2 considerations we mentioned. Most people overvalue the actual tight, short muscles, and they undervalue the weakness in those muscles. And these 5 steps are going to actually help you address it in order so that you cover all your bases, but deal with the most likely scenario first. Step number 1, start by stopping making the back problem worse, the cause of this hip stiffness, this hip tightness, and that comes from education, that comes from understanding how the back works, that comes from understanding what the cause of the back stiffness is. Is it stenosis? Is it a disc bulge? Is it some element of sciatica there as well? Is it some degree of degenerative disc disease or a minor strain to some of those structures in the lower back? But if you can understand that first, you can then stop making the problem worse. And quite often the back stiffness, hip stiffness, glute stiffness isn't actually the problem. That's one step behind, one step removed. So once you've understood how to stop making it worse, we then want to focus on the maintenance of a neutral spine. And you might ask, what is that? So the neutral spine is the natural lordosis, the natural backward bending curve that the lower back has. Now, some people ask questions about, oh, when I'm lying on my back, there shouldn't be a hole under here. Well, there actually should, because you'll notice this forms a nice little bridge. Now, depending on muscle tissue, depending on fat tissue, etc., there may or may not actually be a gap here for you specifically. Depending on the glute development, there may be more or less of a gap there, but that is a neutral spine. Focusing on maintaining that neutral spine is first and foremost the most important thing. But guess what? If you start learning to maintain a neutral spine, you start working harder to maintain that neutral spine rather than slumping into your chair like so, you're going to find there's a little bit of stiffness. There's going to be a little stiffness that creeps up in this lower back. And that stiffness is because the muscles now are working maybe for the first time in a very long time. Maybe for the first time ever that you've really worked on maintaining a neutral spine as opposed to slouching for 6 to 8 hours a day in front of the desk. The next one is when we're moving, move from the actual hips themselves. When you're bending, when you're getting up out of a chair, when you're doing all of these things, bend from the hips, because if we bend from these little hip sockets here, the spine can remain in neutral. You can see how these points are built on from one onto the next, onto the next. Now you can probably tell here, we're going a little bit deeper. I mentioned earlier that the back stiffness or the hip stiffness is 1 point removed maybe from the actual problem. We know what the problem in the overwhelming majority of cases tends to be, and that is the spine. So we're focused on point number 1 and point number 2 and point number 3 with that in our minds. And you can watch tons of other videos that explain a little bit more about the causes of these problems. We won't get into that now. But if we take it back to those hips, you might notice when you're adhering to point number 3, you're bending with the hips, there is actually some degree of stiffness there. That is likely, that's okay, that's good to actually mark off, to recognize, but we'll get into that bit later on in these 5 steps. So now we get into number 4. We've done a lot of stuff where stop doing this, start doing that, think about these things. Now this is an action point. We're actually strengthening the muscles around the hips, we're strengthening the muscles around the lower back and core so they are more competent. Remember those 2 considerations we mentioned at the start of the video. This is number 2, not number 1, number 2. And we're going to be strengthening these muscles. Well, why are we doing strengthening first? Well, in order to move through a greater range of motion, it requires more muscular competence, skill, balance, neurology connecting those 2 as well. And to do that, we want to build that muscle first, rather than just throwing in a bunch of range of motion to the equation, which invariably leads to instability, which then leads to injury, which then leads to the problem getting worse, more stiffness, and we go down in this vicious spiral, which is why a lot of people that end up watching these videos have been doing stretches like the ones we suggest not to do for a very long period of time before they actually see the videos and they're like, ah, man, I've been doing the wrong thing for a while. So strengthening these areas first is the most important thing to do. You want to focus on that, you want to do it in a sensible, correct manner, and there's plenty of guidance on that as well. So now, we have stopped doing things that make it worse. We have focused on a neutral spine, we are bending with the hips, and we have made some strengthening improvement. Remember that point number 4 doesn't happen in a day or a week, it happens over a period of weeks. It takes time to improve the strength in these tissues. Now, point number 5, we can actually start to feed back in some flexibility. We can feed back in some increases in the range of motion. Maybe your ankles are the bit that's limiting your squat. You're not able to go quite so low because the ankle mobility is not quite there. So let's increase that a little bit so we can go a bit deeper. Maybe the hips actually are a little bit objectively limited in their range of motion in a certain range, and we can start improving that there alongside the strengthening so that we are getting an improvement in strength, which will help us deal with that increase in flexibility in a safe manner. So feeding back in this stretching at the right time, in a sensible way, an objective way. Stretching with the right stretching techniques, because a stretch isn't just a stretch, there are better ways you can stretch, better ways that yield objective results, and there are less good ways you can stretch. And you obviously need to do that in a way that doesn't damage the back, thinking about, again, point number 2, that neutral spine. See, we're not against stretching, we're just against unguided or misguided stretching. Do the right thing at the right time. If you do the right thing at the wrong time, then you may as well be doing the wrong thing. Now, no 5-part tip, step, whatever you want to call it, would be complete without a 6th step, which is the bonus. We didn't mention it, but it makes sense because it's something that people will sometimes miss. And that is maintenance, that is progression, that is practice, that is continuing on with these principles for a period of time, that is building. As I said earlier, strengthening doesn't happen overnight. Stretching, actually, flexibility can be improved in a really objective way in a relatively short period of time, but muscle strengthening takes time, and you can see why it's important to prioritize one over the other, because the flexibility improvements can generally be caught up relatively quickly. The strengthening takes time, effort, energy, and a lot more competence, a lot more moving parts with that to really get in line to do it effectively. So the bonus point is that consistency, practicing it for a long period of time and making continual progression, not just doing the same thing at the same intensity for the same period of time. We have to progress. So hopefully you found this video really helpful. You've got those two considerations. You've realized by now which one is a priority and which one isn't, and why maybe people do tend to miscategorize those or misprioritize those. You've got those 5 steps with the 6th bonus tip. You can follow along with those. Hopefully you made some notes. If you didn't, you can always rewind to the video, to different parts of the video, and take some notes down, and then just get on, put it into practice. These things don't happen overnight. Our body needs to respond in kind to the good practices that we put in and the removal of those bad practices. But if you do this consistently, there is an awful lot you can accomplish, and there's not many things that can't be overcome, and we know that from experience anyway. So hopefully you found this video helpful. If you did, give it a thumbs up. Consider sharing it with someone that might also find this helpful. Maybe they're making the same mistakes, they're focusing on stretching at the wrong time. And remember, you can always subscribe to the channel to stay up to date with these videos as they come out, and hopefully they'll help you along the way. Thanks for watching. If you want to learn more about the premium Back in Shape membership, there's going to be a video somewhere underneath here. And if you want to stay up to date or tune in to some of our more recent live streams and the Q&As at the end of those, then that's going to be down here. And remember, you can subscribe to the channel up here and hit the notification bell to make sure you know when we next go live, so you can join us for our next live stream and Q&A.